Hello, welcome to the Roundtable. It's already late April. We'll continue to help you navigate complex global affairs. We are joined by Professor Lee Kyung-suk. Welcome back, Professor Lee.
Thanks for having me.
Today we are also joined by Dr. Jo Bi-young. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
South Korea and the United States began negotiations for deciding a new defense cost-sharing agreement, Special Measures Agreement. If agreed, the SMA will go into effect starting from 2026. It is the first negotiation they have held for a new SMA since their chief negotiators were appointed early last month. Professor Lee, for our viewers, could you explain what SMA, the defense cost-sharing, is?
Okay, this is a great question. First of all, I will give you a brief overview about the United States and ROC alliance history. So in 1953, United States and South Korea agreed about the Mutual Defense Treaty.
Right.
And in 1954, the alliance treaty was become effective. And after that, United States troops are stationing in Korea since over 7 decades. So intuitively, someone have to pay the cost. So the cost burden sharing concept is which party will bear the cost. So in the United States and South Korea agreed in 1963 about the Status of Forces Agreement, the so-called SOFA agreement. And after that, until 1991, United States paid all the money for stationing the United States forces in Korea. But after the end of Cold War, Washington and South Korea re-agreed about the Special Measures Agreement. So this is a point. In that point, both parties agreed upon that South Korea will partially cover the defense spendings in terms of the United States forces troop stationing in South Korea. So the point is, South Korea will cover the labor cost and the logistic cost and also the construction cost about stationing United States forces in Korea. So the labor cost, for example, is USFK employing South Korean workers. Then the South Korean government will pay their income instead of the United States government. And also about the logistic issues, for example, the ammunition storage or the aircraft maintenance, for example. Then the South Korean government will pay the money instead of the United States government. And last is the construction cost. If the United States want to build some buildings and in South Korea for the military military personnel, then United States is not paying the money, rather the South Korean government will pay the money. So there are 3 main components, which is once again the labor cost, the logistic cost, and construction cost in order to station and support the stationing United States forces in Korea. And this is the crux of the Special Measures Agreement.
I see. Yeah. But Dr. Jo, intuitively speaking, that South Korea must not be the only country stationing U.S. troops, right? What about Japan, Germany, NATO countries?
Yes, Japan and Germany, they have housed significant number of U.S. military personnel. Of about 54,000 and 50,000 respectively. And so they have bear the costs. But I would say we can see 3 different areas. One is if we look at the sheer number of the costs. South Korea in 2021, under the latest 11th SMA, we covered $1.03 billion US dollars for that year. For case of Japan, Japan recently increased their budget, and from year 2022 to 2026, Japan will pay about $9.2 billion US dollars, which is by on average, it's about $1.84 billion US dollars. In case of Germany, they don't have SMA agreement. They actually pay the contribution under the NATO umbrella, so it's a little bit different. And then the second different case is how we calculate the costs. For South Korea, we take this so-called lump sum top-down approach, where RK and US first agree on the total amount, and then we allocate the resources according to different categories. In case of Japan and Germany, they take this bottom-up approach, where US would first identify their needs, and then the allies would try to fill in by allocating the resources. Yet Japan also in 2016 recently adopted minimum and maximum guideline on their lump sum. So it's partially South Korea's lump sum approach built on their original bottom-up approach. So it's a hybrid case. difference. And the last key difference are the categories that they are spending. In the case of Japan, they pay for labor costs, utilities costs, military training, equipment, and procurement costs. The last one is the training relocation costs, which is very unique and different from South Korea case.
I see. What I did not hear is salary, right, for U.S. soldiers, because U.S. troops are not mercenary soldiers, so
Right.
they have to be paid by U.S. government,
Right.
not by foreign governments.
Right.
That's interesting. Another interesting point is that Germany, as a member of the collective security system of the NATO, does not have the category of the national defense budget, right?
Right, right,
Because
that's
they don't have the independent national defense. But that's very interesting. All right, proceedly. So, hosting countries pay for foreign troops within their source. Then, what about the case in which South Korea actually sending South Korean troops overseas, like for peacekeeping operation? So, who's going to pay?
Great. So in terms of the overseas deployment, there are two types of overseas deployment. First is the United Nations peacekeeping forces. And another type of overseas deployment is the multinational forces. In terms of the United Nations peacekeeping operations, the South Korean combat troops, for example, went to Lebanon or South Sudan, but the cost was covered by United Nations. But in terms of the multinational forces, for example, South Korea sent the combat troops in Iraq, also the non-combat troops, and also in Afghanistan and Somalia. And these costs are covered by the South Korean government.
I see. Dr. Joe, you mentioned that we are still in the middle of the 11th SMA, right?
Yes.
We are still about a year and 8 months away from the expiration of the existing 11th SMA. Why such a hurry?
As you just mentioned, usually the SMAs will start like a year before expiration date. It's unusual, that's right. And the reasons, I think, two grounds. Number one, RK and US have been doing many things recently. This year, what we will see is the first ever nuclear planning and operation guideline by June. And we will apply that to the August exercise this year. So. Based on this nuclear consultative group that we established last year, many things have been happening. So we can say that the time is very ripe for the negotiation. And the second ground is we would have to talk about Trump. The possibility of Trump coming back to the Oval Office make this negotiation to be started very important. It's good to start the negotiation when the relations are stable and when we know all the people. And also, it's an important institutionalized anchor should Trump try to come back and try to change things. And so it's a strategic and timely decision.
Is it possible for both sides to actually reach an agreement prior to the US presidential election, which is on November the 5th?
So personally, I hope so. But realistically speaking, I think I'm a little bit skeptical. So when you go back to the 11th, the special measures agreement, it took 1.5 years to reach an agreement. So when we start the 12th special measures agreement right now, I think at least we can expect it takes 1 or 2 years. And definitely it's really difficult to reach a satisfying agreement before November's presidential election in the United States.
Recently, Trump stirred a controversy by saying that he would withdraw U.S. from NATO and scrap the collective defense system if European allies do not meet their NATO contribution obligations.
I said, "You didn't pay, you're delinquent." He said, "Yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills."
Considering Trump's hardline stance, even if South Korea and the United States agree on defense cost sharing early, it could be possible he would overturn the agreement if he wins the election in November. So, Dr. Joe, what is your opinion about this possibility?
Well, it's a grim prospect, but I should say we cannot exclude the possibility of Trump reshuffling the agreement. But I would say that on a little bit of optimistic note, I would say two things. One is there is a growing debate among experts that Trump's attention would be turned to NATO first when he comes back. But then I'm not optimistic that Trump's bashing on NATO will not come to our region, but at least it means that we can buy some time. And then the second ground of little bit of optimism is that there are also people saying that if President Yoon and the NSC approach the Oval Office in the early time, so depending on how their relations unfold in the beginning, so if the relation turns amicable, then we may see a continuity of the agreement.
I see. 5 years ago, Trump demanded that South Korea shoulder a greater share of defense expenses, which was closely related to his dissatisfaction with the cost of sending strategic assets of the United States to the Korean Peninsula. How much does it cost for Seoul and Washington to conduct a joint military exercise with the U.S. strategic assets mobilized? Let's take a look at a video clip first.
Armed with military personnel and assets equivalent to the entire air force of a country, the USS Theodore Roosevelt is nicknamed a floating military base. The United States nuclear-powered aircraft carrier appeared in the waters south of Jeju Island. Nuclear-powered carriers like the Theodore Roosevelt carry about 70 to 100 aircraft. When deployed on a mission, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier is accompanied by 2 or 3 destroyers, a submarine, and a combat support ship. An aircraft carrier is staffed with about 6,000 crew members. There is also a post office on it. The Theodore Roosevelt once received 12 tons of mail following the completion of its COVID-19 quarantine. 5 dentists and 6 medical doctors are stationed. The carrier holds at least 90 days of food supplies for a crew of 6,000. How much does it cost to send an aircraft carrier on a mission?
It is widely known that a U.S. carrier, once deployed, spends up to $2 million a day just in operating the carrier itself.
It is known that the hourly costs to fly a U.S. strategic bomber amount to somewhere between $40,000 and $130,000. If they are deployed to the Korean Peninsula, it costs as much as $1.69 million per bomber. It further increases when operational costs for aerial tankers and escort aircraft are included.
The cost could be as high as $100 million for the exercise alone. So it's very difficult to put an accurate number on the actual price, but that's a good ballpark figure. Usually, it is not included in the cost-sharing arrangement or discussions. That may change in the future, but it is a very costly affair.
It is not simple to calculate the costs for operating strategic assets. But one thing is clear, that the amounts are far greater than expected.
I thought it would be enormous, but the actual amount is so huge, far greater than my estimate. In addition to regular pre-scheduled joint military drills, the United States sometimes sends strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula in order to enforce strategic deterrence against North Korea when North Korea makes major provocations and unexpected security crises take place. Dr. Jo, who pays for all those?
Well, the costs are not fixed, but by principle, U.S. and South Korea would pay for their own weapons and their personnel. So simply put, we split the bills. For these irregular cases, U.S. would pay, but as we recall the 11th SMA, Trump's main argument was that South Korea should pay for the relocation, realignment of the USFK and also deployments of those assets. I guess main backdrop to that was that, as mentioned earlier, Japan has the training relocation costs under their SMA, so that may be referenced to Trump's idea.
Is that the new category added to the defense cost sharing between Japan and United States?
Oh, it's not new, but Trump had, I think, was referring to that in order to increase South Korea's portion.
I see. South Korea-U.S. joint military exercises are held under the two countries' close coordination and cooperation. So, Professor Lee, is it possible South Korea to make a proposal to the United States to hold to joint military drills when it decided it is necessary to stage military exercise or demonstrate deterrence capabilities against North Korean military?
So these are really important questions, and I think it's really timely to discuss about these issues. So in terms of the joint military exercises or the strategic asset deployment for the United States in principle should pay it. And this, in terms of joint military exercise, then the South Korean also, the government also like deploying the, for example, naval ships, and they will cost about the personal incomes, the transportation cost, or the fuel cost. It's, Dr. Joe mentioned, it's split. But here comes the point. We have to think about the Trump's personal background and his approach. Trump is kept arguing in his first presidency is South Korea is such a wealthy country, and why these American people have to pay their money to protect South Korea. This is a really important connotations. So Donald Trump, it's unsatisfied that United States it's paying the money to deploy the strategic asset, for example, the B-1B, B-52, the strategic bombers, to protect South Korea. So the debate and really, I would say, a heated point in the upcoming special measures agreement is whether South Korea will accept to create a new readiness component, as United States suggested. And for our perspective, definitely we will not accept any kind of proposal from Washington. But it is highly likely that especially the United States delegation want to include the readiness component inside the cost sharing agreement negotiations.
Yeah, let's stay with this concept of the readiness category that might be added to the SMA in the next round of negotiations. In the context of what you mentioned, the very successful result of the Washington Declaration and the operation of the nuclear consultative group, which are positive development, right? But which enhance the chance for South Korea to invite more U.S. strategic assets for joint military drills. So, Professor, in that case, will both countries, South Korea and United States, come up with agreements to divide the cost and settle the financial responsibilities?
But we have to really look at the current President Yoon's security policies. So after Kim Jong-un ramped up, increased the nuclear and missile capability, South Korea's security policy, it's really embedded in, it rely on United States extended deterrence. And the core element about the United States extended deterrence is relying on United States strategic assets. For example, as everyone knows about the Washington Declaration, after that, there was after 42 years, there was a United States deployed the United States submarine.
Right, nuclear submarine.
Yeah, nuclear submarine in Busan. And we have to look at in details, this is about the cost. Who is paying the cost? And so far, like United States has spent all the money, but now Trump is arguing now. South Korea have to pay the money. So the problem is there's an increase of dependency on United States strategic assets that implies that in terms of the negotiation process, South Korea's strategic position is relatively inferior to United States. So we have to understand about this. And this is really linked to the South Korean security policies, and it's really crucial point because South Korea cannot pay anything, cover anything. And I'm really worried about this kind of cost-sharing burden negotiation will affect South Korea's fundamental security policies because they are really intertwined.
I see. Dr. George, there must be some people inside the U.S. military and the U.S. government to make all the critical decisions about the potential deployments of the nuclear strategic assets of the United States to the Korean Peninsula, especially when South Korean government and military would make requests. Who make all these decisions?
Oh yes, South Korea-U.S. have multiple layers of channels. The KID, Korea-U.S. Integrated Defense Dialogue, the NCM, the SCM. So we have multiple layers through which we decide the scope, time, and how we spend the resources.
Professor Lee, let's go back to some of the points you made.
Yes.
South Korea's leverage in negotiations of the SMA with the United States and South Korea's leverage upon the United States for U.S. decisions to mobilize to send the strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula if necessary. Does South Korea have any effective leverage on the United States? Or South Korea has no other option but to just follow the lead of the United States in this regard?
So, from my perspective, so the threat from North Korea, it's not only a threat for South Korea, it's also a critical threat to Washington. So if the South Korean government requests any additional or irregular joint military exercise, I think Washington will accept the proposal or the request, because it's actually strengthened the deterrence and the security postures. But the point is, the joint military exercise is actually targeting and aiming to deter North Korea's threat. The really a tricky question is, if we are going to accept the readiness component in the special measures agreement, then it's really going to be really ambiguous.
Right.
Like, if United States request South Korea to operate a joint military exercise in the Indo-Pacifics, then who will pay the money? Because in terms of the operational joint military exercise in the Indo-Pacific, the main target is China, and United States wants it. But we are more focusing on the North Korea's nuclear and security threats. So we will pay the money to deter North Korea. But why we have to pay the money for doing the joint military exercise in the Indo-Pacific? So this is a really tricky part, and in that sense, we have to really prudent to think about whether to in terms of the special measures agreement, including the readiness component or not.
Readiness for what, right? That's a really tricky question, right? Dr. Cho, how do other countries do? Because negotiating for money is always a very difficult job, right? For any country. So how do other countries like Japan, Germany do in negotiating the special measures agreement of their own?
Right. South Korea and U.S., in that case, we first decide the lump sum. So we agree on the total sum and then allocate. But in the case of Japan, we always often look at Japan case as an important case to take into account of South Korea's own, which is this kind of a bottom-up approach. So U.S. would first distinguish the categories, and then they would negotiate on each category. And Japan also introduced some caps, so it's a kind of mix of both South Korea and Japan system. So in personal view, I think that has some benefits for in the case of, especially in the current situation where US's presence globally is growing, and US is faced by multiple crises abroad. So there is more demand for costs and more demands for to do things with the allies. So this category base enables the alliance to meet their needs. But I do have some reservation in similar line to what Professor Lee just mentioned. If we are expecting Trump's return, there will be a push for increase in the budget. But if we take this bottom-up category span approach, then we will be exposed to more categories, which means more budgets. But in the end, because South Korea also launched its Indo-Pacific strategy, I think there is some rationale that our spending could increase. But that doesn't mean that Trump's push will be moderate. So that's one thing. And then maybe two other things. I think South Korea could improve in the sense of more showcasing, more displaying how much South Korea is already paying in terms of indirect costs, which Japan is really good at displaying in their SMA budgets and their indirect support. South Korea should do the same and show that to Trump that we have been paying quite enough. And then lastly, South Korea should also seek this multi-year term for the SMA. We have been quite irregular, like one year, 2 year, this time 6 years.
Right.
In case of Japan, it's a 5-year term. So more regularizing these terms could work for South Korea as well.
Many great ideas. The Foreign Ministry of the South Korean government said that the government will proceed with the consultations under the position that, quote, Korea's defense cost sharing should come at a reasonable level to create conditions for a stable stationing of the U.S. troops in South Korea and to strengthen the Allied joint defense posture, end quote. Let's see how both sides will reach an agreement for an SMA for the next few years. It is time to wrap up our program. We'll be back next week with more up-to-date issues. Dr. Jo, Professor Lee, thank you so much for sharing your analysis and insights.
Thank you.
Thanks for the fruitful discussion.
Thanks for watching. and see you next week.